Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name's Jeff Hogan, and I'm here today to talk to you about something called the Social Development Strategy and the possibility to bring resources for the Social Development Strategy to your community. The Social Development Strategy starts by providing young people with opportunities and then teaching them the skills necessary to be successful in those opportunities. Providing recognition leads to strengthened bonds with family, school, and their community. Strong bonds motivate young people to adopt healthy standards for behavior. This strategy has been tested and proven effective. Next is a graphic that we use for participants during our social development strategy trainings. You'll see on the left opportunities, skills, recognition that we just talked about on the previous slide, as well as the bonding on the bottom right with all 4 domains of the young person's life in the boxes beside that, leading on the pathway to clear standards and healthy behaviors. At the bottom of this slide, you also see individual characteristics, which are important to keep in mind as you apply each of these components in the social development strategy. The opportunities that you provide need to be age-appropriate, developmentally appropriate, based on the individual and their individual characteristics to be successful with this. And this slide helps the participants in the social development strategy trainings to get a deeper understanding of those 5 components that have been shown to make the social development strategy successful. So in Pennsylvania, the social development strategy trainings are broken down into 2 parts. What we call the part 1 would be defining risk and protective foundation of the social development strategy, as well as a high-level overview of prevention science. Participants would then learn to identify the key components of the social development strategy using a video from the developer to illustrate the social development strategy, as well as that graphic that we just talked about. And then the participants are asked to provide a personal story that illustrates the social development strategy. And that might be a time whenever somebody used the social development strategy on them when they were growing up, or it might be a time that they've used the social development strategy with youth. And that is really meant to illustrate how the social development strategy works and helps them to remember in their own story each of the 5 components so that they're more likely to be successful in applying all 5 components of the model.
What I'd like to do today is give you a kind of an idea of a personal testimony from my life concerning social development strategy. Now, this is the icon that is commonly used in helping people to understand what this is about, and we'll talk a little bit about this and how I learned for myself with the help of those in my community. This is a picture of the student body at Syracuse Elementary School in 1933. My father was an 8-year-old at that time. He's right here in the center. Today, that school hasn't changed much. The only thing that has been added since that time is this cafeteria and a little custodial storage shed that was on the north, added on to the north of the building. But the school was basically the same when I attended it. At the time of my attendance there, the custodian we all knew as Mr. Marlin. Mr. Marlin was very kind to us kids. He loved us all, and he used to put 2nd graders on his buffing machine because he thought he got a better buff of the floor. So I rode that buffing machine along with many of my peers. This is a picture of the 2nd grade class in 1958. Now, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to look at the census of that class and tell me, was it dominated by girls? And the answer to that question was yes. There were only 8 of us boys in that class and more than double that, girls in the class. This is Mrs. Bessie Schoenfield. She was my 2nd grade teacher. And this is me right here on the front row left with several of my cousins and my best friend. Now, the story I'm going to tell you has to do with this game commonly played by children.
Are you excited? Who's going to get... Wait, are you going to be the kisser?
No.
Are you going to be the kisser?
Probably.
Oh my gosh!
And I was probably the one to be the kisser. In fact, what I did was organize these 7 other boys into a game of kiss tag one lunch at lunch recess one day and played kiss tag with the girls. Now, somebody reported what we were doing out there. And when I came back to the classroom, Mrs. Schoenfield said, "You need to go to the principal's office." Now, the principal in that school is outlined here. I won't tell you his name right now, but he was the principal. I was sent to his office, and my eyes barely reached the height of his desktop when I sat in the chair in front of him. And he said to me, "Mr. Gailey, what is your last name?" And I said, "Gailey, sir." And then he said, "Mr. Gailey, what is my last name?" And I said, "Gailey, sir." My principal in the second grade was Clyde Gailey. He was a distant cousin of my father's, so we both bore the same name. He looked at me straight in the eye and he said, "You have shamed the family name." Now, I didn't know what shamed meant really in those days, but I knew it couldn't be good. And he sent me back to the classroom to apologize to the whole class for my behavior. Now, which I did. I apologized to the whole class, and then being the imp that I was in those days, I asked Mrs. Schoenfield if I could take a few of the girls back into the cloakroom and tell them particularly that I was ashamed of my behavior. And I took my cousin Kathy and several of the other girls that I was related to or had a special fondness for back into the cloakroom, and this is what I did. I kissed them one last time, telling them that I knew they would miss me kissing them. Now, Mrs. Schoenfield wasn't oblivious of all of this. At the afternoon recess, she took me back, but held me back, didn't let me go out to recess, and she asked me this question, and I'll never forget it. She said, "Michael, what is the most important thing to learn in the second grade?" And I thought for a minute, and I thought for a minute, and I thought for a minute, and I couldn't come up with an answer. And this is what she said to me. "Now, Michael, you want to grow up to be a gentleman. I want you to grow up to be a gentleman. Your choices today are not the choices of a gentleman. Your choices need change." Well, I did change, and I love Mrs. Schoenfield then, and I loved her until her death. She was an important influence in my life. Mrs. Schoenfield taught me some skills. One of those was how to care for a kangaroo rat that we called Hoppy. Everybody wanted to care for this rat, feed it and water it, but I became the custodian of this rat for the rest of the school year. She also taught me and invited me to open the doors for girls anytime we left the classroom. I appreciated that. She was teaching me the attributes of a gentleman. Now, she was not the only one. My grandfather was aware of this, and he taught me new skills too. The rest of the year, I helped him after school with his custodial work. And that was a time where I really bonded to my grandfather. I love my grandfather. I lost him at 14, and he, to this day, is an important part of my life. Now, I was recognized for this improvement, not by my grandfather particularly, but I was recognized by Mrs. Schoenfield. My report cards had always talked about my social behavior as always needing improvement. Well, she gave me the most improved student in learning how to be a gentleman award as we left school that year. I love Mrs. Schoenfield, and I really realized that I was participating in becoming a gentleman by the things she taught me. So this is the Syracuse Elementary School back in 1958. It was my first experience with the social development strategy, and it was with my grandfather, Mrs. Bessie Schoenfield, and the principal at Syracuse Elementary School in the second grade. I experienced it then, the social development strategy, but I just didn't know it. Now, I showed you this drawing at the beginning, but I would like to change, and I would like to use something that looks like this. Has similar ideas to it. It has individual characteristics at the bottom. opportunities, skills, and recognitions as being the root, clear standards as one guideline, and healthy beliefs as the other, with the domains of a child, family, school, community, and peer and individual, all these leading to healthy behaviors. Now, my grandfather was the only family that was at school at that time. He taught me some healthy beliefs and allowed me to learn some skills that were important to me. At school, through the actions of Mrs. Schoenfield and Mr. Gailey, I learned behaviors that were appropriate for school. I had peers still to come up to face, and although we were disciplined for this action, we remained good friends and are still good friends. Those of us are still living. My cousin on the right is now deceased. Now, our whole community at that time was family and school. We didn't know much about Syracuse City at that time where I was living, but my whole community revolved around school, family, and my peers. Now, what was important to us is that the school was important for clear standards, teaching clear standards and moderating those at school. My grandfather and my family were important for instilling healthy behaviors that are family owned. Now, all of these things build to opportunities, skills, and recognition, all that are important in a youth's life to develop healthy, clear behaviors.